Cold December morning in 1783, George Washington entered the Maryland State House to perform an act never yet before recorded in history. He came to surrender power. Congress rose as Washington bowed, a tall figure in blue and buff. From his pocket he pulled out a letter of resignation, and in a clear voice said, quote, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the theater of action." End quote. When silence followed, when he finished, and after a brief bow, Washington turned and left. Within hours he was riding home, and by Christmas Eve he was at Mount Vernon, a private man once more. Deeply rooted in tradition, George Washington's conservative worldview led him to lead a life of nobility and service, because he believed in the aristocratic values, he believed in the classical virtues, and lastly, he believed his life was a performance for the ages. Out of all the founding fathers, George Washington embodied the idealism of the Revolution more fully and with more enthusiasm. Yet, he was still greatly shifted by the English federal tradition. George Washington's great-great-grandfather, Lawrence Washington, was an Anglican minister at Oxford and of the Cavaliers, which means he supported King Charles I. He also persecuted the Puritans, and when the Puritans won the English Civil War, Lawrence lost everything. His son, John Washington, was barred from Oxford because of his father's political problems, and therefore sailed to the New World to start afresh. On his way, shipwreck and opportunity entwined, landing him in Virginia. There, his son, Captain Lawrence Washington, and grandson, Augustine Washington, rebuilt the family's name and social status. By the time George Washington inherited Mount Vernon, they were once again owners of a large estate. Estate owners had more responsibilities than just a large property. They had duties such as horsemanship, hospitality, and military duty. George Washington embodied these fully. Specifically, he had a legendary reputation as a horseman. Thomas Jefferson is even quoted saying, quote, "The best horseman of his age, the most graceful figure seen on horseback." End quote. Military service also was something George Washington was enthusiastic about. His first opportunity came to prove himself in the French and Indian War, and later in the skirmish at Jimaville Glen. These both showed his ambition and his inexperience. George Washington's life shows how aristocratic values can coexist with Republican ideals. We continue our argument with Washington's obsession with virtue. Quote, "A good moral is something that is essential for every good man. Therefore, you should strive not only to be learned, but to be of good virtue." End quote, by George Washington. George Washington strived to be full of virtue, specifically mirroring the classical virtues. The classical virtues started in ancient Rome with ancient Roman philosophers, but were later morphed into a Christian idealism. George Washington's lifelong pursuit of virtue started at a young age, where he copied out the 114 rules of decent behavior in conversation and community at the mere small age of 14. Out of all of George Washington's heroes, none loomed larger than Cato the Younger, who Cato was immortalized in Addison's play in 1713 titled Cato. A philosopher and champion of the Roman cause, Cato defied Julius Caesar and ultimately chose suicide over dishonor. Washington valued Cato's incorruptibility and self-sacrifice for his country. In the brutal winter of Valley Forge, Washington even defied a Congressional band on theater and hired actors to reproduce Addison's play of Cato for his troops. It is even recorded saying, quote, last Monday, Cato was performed for an numerous and excellent audience, end quote, from Colonel Bradford. We continue our argument once again with Washington's unusually vivid awareness that his actions would be read, weighed, and redone by the generations to come. Quote, all the world's a theater, and all the men and women merely players. They all have their entrances and their exits. End quote, from the works of William Shakespeare. George Washington knew that a public man would be judged by the stories later told about him. However, it can be hard to see Washington's true character because he worked hard to mask it, and even corrected a reporter who commented on his excitement to return home. Quote, you are wrong, replied he. My countenance has never yet betrayed my feelings, end quote, from the article she later wrote. She also added a incident in which he bit through his lip in order to restrain his anger during the war. Another memorable scene in George Washington's life was when he relinquished power. This surprised the world and the Congress that received his letter of resignation. George Washington did this because he knew that, as the first president, what he did would be seen as what a president should do. He was not a chapter heading for his own book, but of the future biographies of every president to follow. George Washington's last act was his dying act in 1799, when a common cold became a deathbed. Soon, the remedies were as follows. It started with a mixture of molasses, butter, and vinegar, which was used as a cough syrup. Then a servant improvised bleeding. Then a physician applied calomel, which is a derivative of mercury, followed by more bleedings, adding up to 80 ounces of blood loss, and finally blistering with Spanish flies. Washington is quoted saying, quote, let me go, I am going, end quote. Before he died, Washington shook the hands of all 3 doctors that had tried to cure him. He arranged his papers, he said his goodbyes, and, quote, without a sigh, without a groan, the father of his country died, end quote, from Cuttus, one of his slaves. George Washington embodied the old and the new, the old virtues and values in a new country. Micah 6:8 says, quote, the Lord has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. End quote. George Washington embodied this verse in his humble relinquishing of power and his gracious hospitality through all his life. George Washington knew that greatness came not from seizing power, but from releasing power for the ages to come. Thank you.